supposed to start? 2:45 or? It says 11:45 or 11:30?
Supposed to start
Quarter past. Running a quarter of an hour late. Oh, great. Okay, thanks. Let's get rolling in that case. Okay, well, thanks for coming along. And I'm Steve Keen from Kingston University, and my main activities in terms of a positive approach to economics is building this software I call Minsky. But what I want to do is talk a bit about how you should do modelling as well, particularly since Tony Lawson was here yesterday. I've missed Tony twice so far. I would have liked to be here to have this particular discussion because I feel like Tony's approach as a critic of the mainstream, obviously, and so am I. And what the mainstream's been doing for a long time is arguing you've got to work from what they call micro foundations. This is old Robert Lucas making the case back in 1976 that he says that the structure of a model is the optimal decision rules of economic agents. And then talking in 2003, after he's got the Nobel Prize, president of the American Economic Association, very much dominates the tools that economists use, if not the development of the tools towards DSGE. He says the theory ought to be microeconomically founded, and nobody was satisfied with ISLM, and that's actually true from every particular direction, much to their amazement, I think. He thought it had to tie together with micros. The whole idea was to make macroeconomics into applied microeconomics. Now, of course, that's exactly what fluid scientists do. When you analyse water, you start with the idea of a water molecule. It looks like this. And then you show that under certain conditions it'll turn into an ice molecule. Okay? And of course there's also a steam molecule, and my personal favourite is, after all, the snowflake molecule. Yeah? It's total fucking bullshit, pardon the French. It's going to go down well on YouTube, but who cares? The properties of water have nothing to do with the properties of an isolated molecule. They're something which emerge from the interaction of those molecules with other molecules, even though they're identical to each other. You can't even begin to discuss what you're all having drinks in this morning without talking about relationships between entities, even if they're identical. So the idea you could derive the properties of water from a single molecule of water, which is fundamentally what neoclassical Marx tries to do, derive the properties of the demand curve and the aggregate demand curve from an individual utility maximising consumer, and derive the properties of a firm from an individual profit maximising firm. You can't do it. It is just not the right way to go about science. And science has known this for over half a century. One of my favourite papers is a paper by the physics Nobel laureate, and therefore has a genuine Nobel Prize, Philip Anderson. And he said that in looking at the behaviour of physics, and he's not talking at all about social sciences here, though he does actually refer to them, he says that the behaviour of large and complex aggregates of elementary particles can't be understood by extrapolating the properties of a few, or one, as economists prefer to use. That instead of each new level you get of an analysis of sciences, you get new complexities, new types of behaviours which require research which is as fundamental at that level as any lower level. And he said even if you want to array the sciences according to the concept that the elementary entities of one science obey the laws of another, that doesn't mean you can derive the laws of the higher one from the concepts of the lower one. So you have to have new inspirations and new approaches. And he finishes up with this lovely line saying, psychology is not applied biology, nor is biology applied chemistry. And from our point of view, macroeconomics is not applied microeconomics. He also explicitly rejected what the neoclassical school has got itself into, which he called not reductionism, which is a sensible way to try to analyse a complex system up to a certain limit, but what he called constructionism. And that says that rather than just because you can do reductionism to reduce a complex system to a range of entities, most of the way, you can't get complex systems out of that, but you can talk about a huge range of things by reductionism. That doesn't mean you can go in the opposite direction and start from those fundamental laws and reconstruct the universe. Now, if it did, my favourite instance of that would be that a typical biology exam would say, please take these chemicals and create life. Okay? That just isn't the case. And other sciences are wise about that. Economists have actually rediscovered it for themselves and then stuffed up because they didn't like the outcomes. Because if you know what's called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem, that was an attempt to answer the question of whether you could actually derive a market demand curve from the properties of an isolated consumer. And the conclusion was that you can't. Now, they dressed it up in all sorts of sloppy language that just hid the basic point. This is proof by contradiction. You can't get a market demand curve, let alone an aggregate demand curve, from working with the properties of an isolated consumer. When you start from that level and then say what happens when you aggregate, you can derive the curve you can derive for a demand curve by extrapolating neoclassical theory but putting it in the context of more than one agent and more than one commodity, the demand curve can follow any polynomial. There's nothing to mean it has to be downward sloping. Okay? That doesn't mean that actual market curves follow a polynomial. It means that neoclassical theory doesn't have an explanation for the market demand curve, let alone an explanation for aggregate demand when working from the level of microeconomics. So you can't do macro by extrapolating from micro, but that raises a legitimate question that Tony raises: how do you do it instead? And the classical argument, the classical approach you can see in pre-neoclassical work, the classical school, and also the post-Keynesian school to some extent, and certainly evolutionary economists as well, is the structure of capitalism gives you its basic dynamics. If you have to rely upon the behaviour of entities, the behaviour of individual entities, how utility maximising this, profit maximising that, you're not necessarily going to get the dynamics. It's actually the structure that gives it to you. And of course Marx put it best by saying men make their own history, but they don't make it as they please. They make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances already existing, given and transcending from the past. Let's boot this bloke out and slot in somebody who knows slightly more about society and how one should actually model, which is Marx. Not the neo-labour theory of value, of course, which I also reject on philosophical grounds from within Marx, but what's been done by post-Keynesians in the past. When you look and characterise what all the various people like Garignani and Straffer and co have done, they've tried to derive the dynamics from the actual social and physical structure of the economy. So I want to use that and pose the ultimate question about capitalism, the life, universe and the everything question: is it stable or unstable? Now, if you go from the neoclassical point of view, of course they end up with the proposition that it's stable. And my favourite statement, this comes from Edward Prescott, another guy who's involved in building real business cycle theory, got the Nobel Prize for that. And he wrote this remarkable paper. I highly recommend downloading it, particularly on a Friday night with drinks or whatever else you prefer intoxicating yourself with, because it's the only way to take this stuff seriously. The Marxian view is that capitalist economies are inherently unstable and that excessive accumulation of capital will lead to increasingly severe economic crises. That sounds pretty correct, don't you reckon? Unfortunately, he kept on going, and he then said growth theory, which has proved to be empirically successful, which is total crap. Just tells that to Robert Solow, he'll be rolling around on the floor laughing, saying how nonsensical that proposition. And Solow invented the second inventor of growth theory. So the capitalist economy is stable and absent some rules change in technology. The economy converges to a constant growth path with a stable doubling every 40 years. And of course, saying this in 1999, he got away with it to some extent, but of course after 2007, it doesn't look so crash hot. Now the Marxian, the heterodox alternative, which from Minsky derives from Marx, of course you won't find that in his writings, but of course his first major intellectual influence was Karl Marx. But then reading through Schumpeter and Fisher and ultimately Keynes, his proposition was that the neoclassicals think there's some stable financial system which would make serious financial crises impossible. The alternative view, which he called unreconstructed Keynesianism, is that capitalism is inherently flawed, being prone to booms, crises and depressions, and this instability is due to characteristics the system must possess if it's to be consistent with full-blown capitalism. I recommend reading the article. Minsky does admit that he's making an extreme claim here to say that it's inherent. And it comes down to the role of finance in generating both a desire to invest and then the capacity to finance that investment. Now, I want to pose that question by starting from the opposite end to the neoclassicals. Rather than starting from the micro and building up, I'm going to start from the macro and work down, but start from a set of identities. Nobody can disagree with this. Even Tony would have to concede this one of you is in the room. And the employment rate is employment divided by population, period. It's just a definition. And equally, I can extend the definition and say that employment is output divided by labour productivity. Do the same thing to wages share of output. That's wages divided by output. And the debt ratio, of course, private debt's what I'm talking about here. The debt ratio the debt level divided by GDP. Now, you can't dispute those. They're simply definitions. But if you put them in dynamic form, so in other words, put them in mathematical symbols and then do your chain rule and product rule expansion, this is what you get. The employment rate will rise if real growth, the real economic growth rate exceeds population growth and growth in labour productivity. The wages share of output will rise if money wage demands exceed inflation plus the growth in labour productivity. This is monetary terms. And the private debt ratio will rise if the rate of growth of private debt in nominal terms exceeds the sum of inflation plus the rate of economic growth. Okay? They're simply expanding those definitions out and including money, which I do in a later version of the model. Now, this is effectively how Richard Goodwin proceeded back in 1967 when he took Marx's verbal model from 1867, which explained a trade cycle in Volume 1 of Capital, which is a very unexpected place to find those sorts of arguments. And he started by saying, well, let's start from that definition. So you say you define lambda as employment divided by population. I'm getting in for population. You then get a chain rule coming out of a product rule coming out of that. Go through your expansions, substitute various points all along the way, and you finally end up, of course if I was doing this in a lecture I'd take a bit more time through this particular slide, that's the equation you end up with, and that's what I used beforehand. That's the rate of change of the employment rate is going to be the growth rate minus growth of productivity and growth of population. Okay? And that's where that particular statement comes from. Same thing applies if you go through the wages share of output. Put that down into the ratios. You then find it actually becomes a differential of the real wage divided by output per worker. Again, expand that through. It's just basically, this is one of my math lectures called money for old rope. Okay. It looks complicated if you haven't done it before. Once you've done it, it's pretty mechanical. It just, you can get a monkey there and it'll pump the same stuff out. You can just use Mathematica or MathCAD. It'll ultimately give you the same sorts of solutions. And that's where the wage share of output will rise if wage demands exceed growth and labour productivity comes from. And the final one is there's the debt ratio. And then you say, well, that's equal to that private debt divided by GDP. Again, expand out a product rule. You finally get down to the stage where you've got that expression that simply says the debt ratio will rise at the rate of growth of debt exceeds the rate of growth of GDP. Okay? So all basically impossible to contradict. Now, the simplest way to model that is to, and by the way, I used to work with, when I first did this, I modelled using a nonlinear set of behavioural functions. Carl Chiarella, who's both a good friend and a leading nonlinear dynamics person from University of Technology, Sydney, he and Peter Flashel said you should work from simple linear behavioural models, and I agreed, you're right, I should have done that. So I want to show you what happens when you do that. So I'm going to work with the simplest possible model, having output being a linear function of capital, investment a linear function of the profit rate minus depreciation, employment a linear function of output, and the wage change, Phillips curve, a linear function of employment. And the way that I bring in debt is to say that change in debt is equal to investment minus profits. Now, of course, that's turning it from a set of identities into a model. And what you finally get when you do the mathematics of all that are these equations here, which I'm not going to take you through them in detail, but I'll show you how to build them in Minsky. Who's got a computer with Minsky on it, by the way? Anybody? I'll bring it up if you can, but I'll rapidly build it. Now, I know these things scare a lot of people. It doesn't scare Tony, but he'd rather reject them. But what you get out of this, and this is the important point, is fundamental non-linearities. And I love making references to the Big Bang Theory whenever I can. So, as Sheldon and Sheldon and Amy, found out non-linearities make things much more interesting, interactions. So what I've got going on here is the employment rate is multiplied by wages share of output and by debt in the first equation. The wages share of output is multiplied by employment in the second, and the debt is multiplied by the wages share and itself in the third equation. Now what that gives you are structural, quasi and actual quadratics in the model. So you've got fundamental, you can't get rid of them. You can only reform them by abolishing capitalism. Okay? Not going to happen. So what you get out of that, and you put it together in Minsky, I'm going to have capital determining output, so that's a simple accelerator relationship. Output determining employment, so I've got A as labour productivity. Employment rate determining the rate of change of wages, so that's the Phillips curve type relationship, rate of change of wages being a function of the employment rate. And using a linear one, Phillips insisted on a nonlinear, and he's right, and he had three factors, not one, which I talk about in my lectures at Kingston. But that's the linear equation I'll use here. That's a level at which no change in employment wages occur, and that's the slope of the change function. And I do a similar thing when I bring in investment. Now, to do this in Minsky, has anybody used system dynamics software here before? Okay, some people have. It's a platform which has been around for 45, 50 years. It was first invented to do the limits to growth. and it then got split in two directions. One direction went off to management science with things like Venn, Sim, Stella, I Think, and so on. And the other direction went off to engineering, programs like MATLAB, Simulink, my favourite Viz, Sim, and quite a few others. So Minsky is just using the same basic concepts, but adding the capacity to model the financial system there and stealing the best ideas from those various software packages too. This is one of the funny things. I was challenged when I was building Minsky with the first grant for the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I got a tweet critical of me saying from Noah Smith. You know Noah Smith, semi-neoclassical, semi-what blogger. Saying, should he waste his time writing a critique of Keynes' stupid Minsky software? And I wrote back and got involved in a debate with him. And then he said, before we start, tell me what the wires do, inverted commas. And I realised, bloody hell, this kid thinks that I invented the idea of flowchart software to do dynamic modelling. He had no idea of MATLAB Simulink, which people take $2,500 for. And he thought I was causing cycles by having unnecessary lags out of the wires. You know, talk about jumping the shark, as I told him he was doing. He didn't particularly appreciate that. So what you do is you draw your model on this canvas. You use the tools that are sitting up here, all a range of mathematical tools and functions, and then you control the simulation by controlling its speed, whether you run it and do a step-by-step or continuously, and you can zoom in various parts and so on. That's the basic logic. So you put variables and mathematical operators on the canvas and you join them using wires. So that second equation in Goodwin is, as I showed you beforehand, was output is, labour is output divided by labour productivity. Well, you can enter that in two ways in Minsky. You can click on variable up here, which you can see in the interface, okay, and you can then, it brings up a window and you name it, or you can simply type straight onto the canvas. And this is one thing which Minsky has that the other software packages don't have. And I'll show you that in a moment. So what you've done is you start defining it. You're actually defining a set of differential equations over here. And I'll show that the most important element of this in general is the integrator block. So you take an equation like the rate of change of capital is investment minus depreciation. What you do is you integrate both sides. So you're saying capital is equal to the integral of investment minus depreciation. And then rather than doing it symbolically, you do it numerically. So in Minsky, it ends up looking like that. What this has here is, there's your integral block and capital. There's a bloody piece of bug software as well, get rid of that. There's investment, and there's depreciation. Okay, and Minsky then simulates that using integration because it's a more stable method than differentiation. So if I start from the definition of capital, I'm going to use this range of simple variables. So I'm going to have 3 for the capital output ratio, A for labour productivity, just normalising at one worker per unit of output, 10 for the slope that workers react to the gap between actual employment and a level that gives you stable wages, 60% of the population being where you get zero change in wages. I'm using total population rather than employment rate, depreciation rate of 10%, 120 workers, etc., and starting from 300 units of capital and wages being starting off at 0.8 of a unit. Now those are the equations that go into the model, and what they look like on the canvas is things like that. That's the investment one I've shown you a moment ago. So let's just bring up Minsky and I'll quickly start showing what it's like to build that. I won't necessarily finish it. How much time do we have to go? Oh, okay. I might take it slowly in that case. Would it be worthwhile? Okay. Well, when you do these things live, you can always make stuff up. So, okay. So brace yourself. And there's also, because it's only had $250,000 Australian, which is about $220,000 in total. Compare that to MATLAB, that's probably have a couple of $100 million. Okay, so there's all sorts of bugs you don't quite knock out of the way when you've only got one program and a small amount of money there. But I'll start from the output level. If I just type Y on the canvas here and press the Enter key, that's to find a variable Y. Can you see that on screen? Okay. Now, Y divided by A, which is labour productivity, is going to be equal to labour. And now once I've done that, if I want a divided by key, I just simply type the divided by key and Minsky inserts that on the keyboard. And notice then that when I go over one of these icons, I'll actually zoom in a bit so you can see more clearly. Just actually redraw that too to get rid of the marks. All this sort of stuff is things we'd want to fix up with more money to develop Minsky further. But you can now see the divide by block there. So the big circle turn-ups when you bring the cursor close to the object, and that's then letting you know that you're then in wire mode where you can drag and connect variables together. So I've now got labour there. Let's now bring in n for number of workers. Notice that it starts too small. If I move it, it'll move to the right size. Again, one of these bugs we want to address. Another divide by key. And I then am going to have here. Now, this is where Minsky, the fact that I'm typing directly on canvas is an improvement over all the other rival programs. And none of the others support that yet. They also don't support anything other than English, than Latin characters. But if you type a backslash and lambda, Minsky will convert that into the Greek letter lambda for you. So we support what's known as latex. Anybody use latex for that? Okay. So you can directly work, and you've got a range of latex commands there as well. That's the beginning of it. Now I've got enough to find the employment rate, and I want to then subtract. So that's the actual employment rate. Let's subtract that from that the rate where there's no change in wages. So if I type lambda and then underscore, which is the command in latex for a lowercase, and Z for 0, then I've now got lambda Z defined there. Okay, and I don't want to divide by key. If I press the wrong thing, you just delete it. So if I notice there's a blue dot turning up there on the line. If I press the blue dot now, then I delete that line. I press the delete rather. I delete the line and reattach it again. So I want a minus key here. Let's do that. Okay, now let's also give a value for Z, because I haven't actually typed a value in there yet. I'm just going to save that because I don't want to have it crashing and not have anything saved while I've been doing it. Just to see if I've got the Manchester. Okay, so I'm going to call this is going to be a Goodwin demo, or demo of Goodwin. Okay, so let's just give a value to that. And I'm going to, if you either double click or right click, I'm going to edit this. I'm going to make it into a parameter. We have 4 types of variables in Minsky: constants, parameters, flows, and integrals. Okay, and then you can change between each of them as well. You don't have to do this, but it makes things more sensible. So I'm going to do the value of 0.6, meaning if 60% of the workforce has a job, then there's no change in wages. And I can also change it into a slider. And if I go back in here, this is more laborious than it needs to be. Again, this is sort of stuff we'd like to speed up. But I can now, so let's give it a range between 0.8 and 0.5 with a step level of 0.01, which is a 1% change. So you can actually vary those levels while you're doing a simulation as well. So that's the gap between employment and the actual, and the level where there's no wage change. I also want to have the slope inside there as well. So you'll have lambda underscore S for slope. I typed Z by accident. Let's just, how do I do that? Okay. That's going to be another parameter. I'm going to do the value of 10. Now this might be where I get a crash out of it. Let's see what happens. I survived that. That's good. Okay. Make that into a slider as well, and edit that and give it a value range of, say, between 20 and 1 with a step size of 1. And now I multiply, so just type the multiply block. Multiply that by the gap between actual employment and that no change rate. And what you've got, you might as well enable it, is your Phillips curve. So I'll type P lowercase, actually PH lowercase c. I'll just make it uppercase c for the heck of it. That's your Phillips curve. So attach those together. They'll now change in size as I move. That's your Phillips curve. So you multiply that by the wage rate, you're going to get the wage rate. Now the wage rate, when I'm doing it at the level of the macro, working in a full form rather than reduced form. So I haven't converted things to ratios. I'm working with actual capital and actual wages and so on. So I need to have wages there, and this is where the most important system dynamics element of the program comes from. Notice this integral block up here. I can click on it, or I can actually type the ampersand key. We have various shortcuts. Do I risk running the ampersand key? No. I'll click on it. I might try that for later. Actually, I'll save it now. I have what I call a Tammany Hall approach to saving. I save early and save often, okay, in case things go wrong. And I often save multiple versions as well. So I'm confident about that, but I will type the ampersand key, because this, another thing we're going to bring in keyboard shortcuts, as well as typing multiply to get a multiply block and minus and divide. You can also type the ampersand, and that will give you an integral block. Okay. Again, it's just trying to make things faster. And I'll call this W underscore R for real wage, and I've got to give it an initial value because you have to have initial conditions for system states like that. Notice also the WR doesn't change in size. That's another bug we have to address. Now, once I've done that, that's a mistake. Get rid of that. What I've got to do is multiply the Phillips curve by the wage rate to get the actual wage. So one option you have here, when you right-click, you can either copy the entire thing, or you can just copy the variable. So I come down here, choose copy variable. I get a copy of WR, bring it over here, and I say multiply the Phillips curve by the wage rate, integrated, that is the wage rate. It's basically a percentage rate of change. So I'll save that as well. And if we go across to the equations tab, you can now see I'm starting to define a dynamic system. Okay? And it's quite possible to teach students this before they even learn what a differential equation is, which is one of the reasons why this software is so popular. This type of software is so popular with engineering departments these days. And now we're finding a lot of maths departments are using Minsky because they can do things in Minsky they can't do in the other software packages. They can type alpha and stuff like that, yeah.
You save it, does it save as a binary file?
No, it saves as XML file. Okay, so again, we've got I've got a brilliant programmer doing all the coding here, Russell Standish, who's the bloke who's done almost all the coding, except for a small amount he's outsourced at various times. Russell is a PhD in physics. He did physics because he couldn't do a study in complex systems at the time. It didn't exist, but his whole interest was complex systems. And he built a model, a platform called Ecolab, which you can also find on SourceForge and GitHub, as a multi-agent modelling tool to model evolution. Okay, so the guy seriously knows his stuff about evolution. He also became the director of the high-performance computing unit in Sydney when there was such a thing. And then, of course, in the usual way that progress occurs in academia, you establish something good, then you shut it down. That's what they did. So that may put him onto the freelance workforce, and being a professor of applied mathematics, he became a freelance programmer, but he does high-performance computing. He knows how to handle vector array operations and all that sort of jazz. So I've got a top-class person working on the code behind, but of course top-class person with a small amount of funding. So, okay, now I've got enough at this level to actually define the entire model, because I've now got the wage rate here and I've got labour back here. So I just right-click and choose copy, and then place labour here, and then multiply labour by the wage rate. I've got the wage bill. Hang on, I didn't quite get the circle right there. You've got to be inside the circle for it to go across to drag mode. That's now the wage bill. Let's call it capital W. Now with wages, if I subtract wages from output over here, then I've got profit. Okay, so let's define profit. Let's use uppercase pi. So I type capital P and lowercase I, and I get pi, the symbol for the Greek letter for P. There's my profit level. Now what I'll do, just for the sake of building the model quickly, I'll just have capitalists investing all their profits, which is what Goodwin had in the original Goodwin model. So I simply can type I here, and I'll make it I_G for gross investment. Connect those two together. I've now got gross investment occurring. Of course, investment is the rate of change of the capital stock, so I need another system state down here, and I'll just bring that down here and label that as K and give that a value of, say, 300. And now, of course, it's getting messy. It's going off the screen. The size of the palette is 100,000 by 100,000 pixels. If we actually had hardware that could drive that, that'd wrap around the entire wall here, maybe a couple of times. So the idea is to have an enormous canvas in which you can do this. You can also group and structure things that way, which we're still improving how grouping goes on. But the obvious thing you want to do is flip that around. So there's a command flip on the right-click keyboard, and I can then have that flipped around here. Now I've got K. I want to take a copy of K and have this being multiplied by the depreciation rate. So if I type \delta, which is going to give me the Greek letter for delta, underscore, and I'm going to type curly brackets, K, close curly brackets. I'll show you why that's also a grouping command, to group more than one character for being subscripted in LaTeX. But one thing we haven't quite done yet, you've also got superscript operations. Well, the superscript is the caret. And if you try to type the caret right now, you get a power key coming up in Minsky. So you've got to do this in the little definition window up here. So if I now type K superscript R, what I get, as you can see, is a fairly nice piece of formatting there. Again, this is not possible in any of the other programs, which have got, some cases, millions of dollars of product development time behind them. So having done that, let's just move this around a bit, multiply the two together. Okay. subtract that, pardon me for the wrong key, subtract that, whoops, we haven't got an escape key implemented to get to make cancel when you type in the wrong operations. Okay, so drag this down here, and I then want to attach these two up here, and then attach that. Now it's looking pretty messy. So you notice the little blue dot turns up on a line, you drag and you get a curve out of that. Let's just move this over a bit. So having done all that, with K here, I just simply have to divide K by the accelerator, which is V. Let's give that a value of 3. Again, make that into a parameter. And let's also make that into a slider. So let's drag it around a bit till it turns up the right size. Make it into a slider and give V a value of between, say, 2 and 4. Sorry, 4 for the maximum, 2 for the minimum, and say 0.1 is your step size. Okay, and then simply divide capital here by the accelerator, and that, hopefully, if I made any stuff-ups on the way, is going to give me output. Okay, now let's just try, I'll just drag this, whoops, oh great, except there's not a sign of a bug coming my way. Let's see, okay, so I drag the line around a bit. Because what I normally do is whack my graphs in here. Once you drag the line a bit, you get a chance to build it further out using what are called Bezier curves. And if it gets too complicated, just you choose right-click and you can choose straighten to go back to the original shape. Let's whack a graph inside here. Actually, I'll whack it up here now, given the scale I've blown this up to. And let's see what's happening to the employment rate. Take a copy of that. Got to flip it, because once you've flipped in one direction, it maintains the flip into the next character. So there's the employment rate, and I'll just save it there and pray that I've got it all done right properly. It's invalid divide by infinity. Okay, so what I've got here, A, I haven't got a value for A. So I've got to give that a value. This is, again, good error checking is useful. So if anybody's used Mathematica, get error messages back with your name is actually Hal, which is not Russell's son, but the computer on 2001, maybe you can understand them. But I prefer to have meaningful English language error messages, and so does, you notice the little circle appear to tell you where your major error. Little checks like that. So this is going to make that into a parameter. Actually, I won't make it a parameter, I'll make it a flow and give it a value of 1. I'll show you why I'm doing that in a moment. So, and of course, having a population of value of either, so I'm going to give that a value of, say, 120. Having done all that, now save it again and hit the stop button, because that often resets some of the memory states. There we go, cyclical behaviour. Okay, cool. Right. Now, what I've got here is, of course, capitalists investing all their profits. I'm just going to change the scale here. If I click the 0 key, that resets to the original scale. You can see I was only using a small amount of the space that's available there. You can group. It's still kludgy, so I'll show you grouping quickly. If I do rubber band around that, all those areas go grey. If I right-click inside that area, I can choose group. It doesn't look very good at the moment, and doesn't reset it. That should actually all be erased by the program. Once I click elsewhere, if I try file and redraw, let's see. Oh, great. Still showing up there. Okay, it's going to now ungroup that. Right, now it's all moved, so you can see I've made more space there. And I'll right-click and choose straighten here. And then let's make it a bit larger that away, and do that again on another one of the dots here, and then I'll do the same for this one over here. So I've got a bit more of the sort of way I like laying these things out, but it's not just, again, this is why you need a large amount of space and a good monitor for this sort of work. But I've now got a gross investment turning up here, which I've just simply got capitalists investing all their profits. So what I want to do, and get what I'm heading to, by the way, is getting back to this stage where I put those three definitions together and see what happens. So I got to here. Let's now say that there's actually having a rate of profit, having a level of profit. If you now divide, let's just move these ones around a bit so I can actually see our K here. There's K. Copy of that. Notice it's flipped back in the right direction again. If I divide profit by capital, and I've got the rate of profit. Let's use lowercase pi underscore lowercase r to indicate that. There's the rate of profit. Now it's going to be a flow. And pardon me, in my mouth, I had a real external mouse with this keypad, and it failed, so I can't use it right now. So I've got to do this step by step. There's the rate of profit. Let's now see, there's also same sort of story for capitalists. There's some minimum rate of profit at which they will invest exactly what they earn. More than that level they want to borrow, less than that they repay outstanding debt. So I'm going to make this into a parameter and give it a value of say 3%. And we can then vary that dynamically once I make it into a slider. Again, I'd like to make all these steps possible to do in one go, but it's just, again, it just takes time to get the coding written so you can actually put all these operations together in one go. And vary it between, say, 10% rate of profit and a 1% rate of profit with a step size of 1% for that minimum rate at which they're willing to invest. So you subtract that, you've now got the gap between the actual rate of profit and the rate of profit at which they simply invest retained earnings, and then let's just move this over here a bit, multiply that by a response rate. So again, I'm going to have the idea of a slope function. Again, this is all a linear function, so pi underscore capital S for slope, and then again, same story, make it into a parameter, give it a value of 10, which is the same value I've used for the workers. Doesn't really matter, I'll show you why in a moment, but it is actually a crucial variable in the system, a crucial parameter. So I'm going to give that a range of between 20, let's say, with very reactive capitalists, and 1 with a step size of 1. So now that's going to tell me how much of output capitalists are going to be willing to invest. So I've got to multiply that by output. I'll just straighten this line here too, by the way. It's straightened that line. And then I'll drag it out a bit too, again, just to make things fit together better. Okay. So now I've got how much capital is going to invest of a share of output. I need to now multiply that by output. So I copy this, bring y across, and then multiply that by y, and that's now going to be gross investment. Okay, and I'm going to save that as the difference. We don't have a shortcut key for save as yet. I'll call this demo Goodwin 02. Okay, and then reset. What do you reckon is going to happen? What's going to happen? I'll just bring. We ponder that. I'll just actually. I'm going to add a couple of system states, a couple of variables to the system here. I'm going to have output divided by wages divided by output, which I'm going to call omega, and that's going to be the wages share of output. So those are the two system states in Goodwin's model. I haven't got debt here yet. So divide that and call this D. Sorry, call it omega, pardon me. Okay, and then collect that together. And now let's graph omega over here. I can label the graphs, but I'll leave that for a second. There's omega. And now what I can also do, this is one of the reasons you might be wondering why there's so many markers on it. It's because it's to set up to do XY plots and double Y axes as well. So I copy that and whack, let's put employment on the vertical axis, and if I right click and choose wages share output down here, if I attach to the same colour, attach to the same colour on the bottom of that graph, then it will do an XY plot of the two, and you get up to 4 on one graph. Actually, you can do up to 8. I wouldn't bother. Okay. What do you reckon is going to happen?
Well,
yeah.
The way the system works, presumably, is as the rate of investment goes up, demand for labour goes up.
Yeah.
When you're reflecting off Phillips curve, wages start going up, that reduces the profit share.
Yep.
So they're also.
Yep. Okay. You reckon it'll be closed cycles or open cycles?
The original Goodwin model is closed cycles, isn't it?
Yeah. You know your stuff here, but I'm just pushing your memory.
I need to go for an open cycle, simply because I think you put in something extra.
Well, okay, here we go. Surprise for you. Let's actually reset it and actually make us think of closed cycle. See, it's still only a two-dimensional system.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd need to actually change the stability properties of those two dimensions. The eigenvalues, in other words, qualitatively haven't changed. I've still got 0 on the diagonal. Okay, off diagonal, I've got the complex components. So it hasn't actually changed the nature of the model. What you've got to do to change the nature of the model is bring in the third dimension, which is what I've set this up for, because this is what I did with my PhD. I wanted to model Minsky's hypothesis by simply adding debt to Goodwin's model. Okay? And one of the little ironies, Goodwin and Minsky both worked at the same university. They were both, I think, at Washington State, or not, maybe it was second place after Washington possibly. And they didn't like each other. And you had one guy who was hyper-mathematical, who's Goodwin, and Minsky, who'd done mathematics, but had tried to build a model using Hicks's bastardized version of Harrod, the so-called multiplier accelerator model, and hadn't got anywhere. They didn't communicate, and they never got together to work together. So ironically, I find myself combining two people who worked at the same university, could have done brilliant things that they'd combined, and they didn't combine. Anyway. Okay, so now what I've got is, I've now got gross investment over here. What I've got back here is profits. Let's take a copy of that. So if I now have, if investment exceeds profits, capitalist's going to borrow money. So if I have investment minus profit, again, I didn't mean to type that key. Again, the keyboard takes a single click as a double click sometimes. It won't happen. It's just happening just on my machine because of the very sensitive mouse pad here. So there's investment minus profits, so I'm going to make that the rate of change of debt. So I need another integral down here. I could have just simply typed the ampersand to do that quickly. We call it D, capital D for debt, because we're talking about total aggregate debt here, and private sector debt. And then, of course, just for the heck of it, so I can actually show the debt ratio, I can take a copy. I can do it anywhere else on the capital if I felt like it, because one thing we do, which some of the packages don't do, is we pass variable values by variable name as well as by wire, as they call it in the profession. So standard packages like Simulink and some, I think there's also Stellar and Bensim, you've got to wire stuff up to make things tie together. Okay? With Minsky, this is borrowed from VisSim, which is, if you're looking for an engineering package, VisSim is my favourite. Okay, I much prefer it to Simulink. VisSim lets you pass by variables, so you can define, so you have a wire going into something, that becomes the variable, then becomes either the wire or the name, and you can put the name anywhere else you like on the system. So you get much cleaner engineering diagrams out of VisSim, and that's what I've borrowed for this idea here. Now I've got a debt ratio, and of course once you've got debt up here, you've got to multiply by an interest rate to work out what your debt payments are. So I'm going to type R_L for rate of interest on loans here. Give that a value, let's make that a parameter. Give that a value, say, of 5%. And then I've got to go back here and choose it to be a slider. Again, I've got to improve that interface trick at some stage. But any donations to Minsky's development, happily received. Every $100 Australian, which is about 45 quid English, I think, buys an hour of Russell's programming time. Highly worthwhile. So I'm going to give it a value, say, between 10% maximum interest rate of interest, and make it 20%, and a minimum of, say, 1% with a step size of 0.01%. Having done that, you then multiply that by the debt level, and again, I could do this. I'd have to do this by wire if I was using any of the other programs except VisSim, but I can simply just type, for example, INT for interest here. Again, that's my mouse key being interpreted as a double click. Bloody hell. Sorry. This is a very Australian presentation. Lots of swearing. Okay. Interest there, take a copy of that. Now, but then if I now subtract interest and wages from output, then I've now got net profit. And one thing, again, which Minsky does, and again, this is all the stuff work with Russell, trying to make it as compact a program as well. None of the other programs support this either. But obviously, if I've got a plus in the top of the block and a minus in the bottom, then I can add as many as I like to each of those tops to get a lot of things added together and a lot of things subtracted from in one go. So with all the other programs, you've got to add additional spots before you can do an addition. With Minsky, you simply drag it up to where, well, again, bloody... Okay, there we go. I was holding back on a stronger swear word there. I don't want to be banned from YouTube. Okay. There's output minus wages and interest. Okay. So having done all that, I'm going to save that. Again, give it a different name. Let's call it. I've got to call the demo Minsky one. Having done that, pray that I didn't make any buggers, stuff ups, and there you got nice convergence to equilibrium. Isn't that wonderful? Okay. Except that it's not. Take a good look at what's happening. Good night, Josephine, to the economy. Okay. Now, I'm cheating a bit there. I've got to tell you why. Because that is a given if you have no technical growth and no population change going on. It's a given. Reason being, when I solve for the equilibrium in this system, the equilibrium debt ratio is given by a set of terms divided by alpha plus beta, where alpha plus beta are the rate of change of population and the rate of change of technology. If I don't have any of that going on, the equilibrium debt ratio is infinity. Okay, so it's going to break down. So let's go for the final stage of fixing this up, because over here I've got A just as a parameter, or a constant. No, it's actually a variable I haven't actually tied it down. I can choose add integral now. This is again one of the things we've done to make it possible to flip between models where you have things as parameters, then you make them into variables, and you might make them into system states as well. Add integral, I now got an A down here, and if I now right click and take a copy of the A variable, that's a mistake. I meant to take a copy just of A itself rather than the whole integral block. So copy the variable. Okay. And then I want to multiply that by alpha. So backslash ALPHA for alpha. Make alpha a parameter. And give that a value of, say, 0.025, which is a 2.5% rate of labour productivity growth every year. I won't make it into a slider yet, but you can see that I can do that if I wanted to. So I've shown you other cases. Multiply block, wire them together. By the way, even getting the size of the circles right, so it was easy to do this, was a pain. Okay, because we had various sizes of circles we'd try, and sometimes you wouldn't be able to quite click on them accurately, so I think we've fine-tuned it reasonably well here. So that's labour productivity defined. I'll now do the same thing to population. So come down and choose add integral. Right click and take a copy of the variable. Okay, I didn't. You see, it attaches to the cursor until you click. So I've lost the n up here, but I'll just click up here and drag. I can bring it down. So there's n. I want to multiply it by beta. So beta. And again, just to save time, I'll make beta 1.5% population growth. And I won't bother making it a parameter, but again, you can see how I could do that and give a slider value and so on. And then multiply those together. Save that again, hit stop, and now hit run. What happens? Same basic dynamic. And notice what's happening. You've got diminishing cycles and then rising cycles again. And that was the thing when I first did my PhD. I still remember exactly where I was when I first saw that. Okay? I was in the spare bedroom in my then marital home in Marrickville. I've forgotten the actual, I think it was about 8 o'clock at night. And I thought, what the fuck is going on here? Hello, French. And I then had to look back and see what did I discover, because I was trying to model a system that gave me a debt crisis. I'll show you the debt ratio, which I haven't actually modelled here. Let's now just bring a graph down here, and I'll just simply, just to save time, I'll just wire straight from the D block there onto that axis, and now just stop and start it again, and you can watch what happens to debt there. And notice it appears to settle down, and then it goes for a period where it cycles and bounces around like crazy, and then finally, ultimately, you go to the stage where you go to an infinite debt ratio, zero employment and zero wages share. Okay? So that was an incredible, unexpected outcome of the model. Yeah?
It's a background question. I presume you've got somewhere in Minsky control of your, what you're going to would be the sampling rate.
Control of what?
Would be the sampling rate.
Yeah.
Would be the step. Would be the size of the step.
No.
You've got some rapid dynamic changes there, and you're obviously all steps, smaller dynamics
That's actually covered by what's known as the Runge-Kutta algorithm. Okay, which, I mean, again, when you're simulating a dynamic model, there's a whole lot of mathematical theorems behind whether you can actually numerically simulate a chaotic system, okay, called the beta shadowing hypothesis and a range of ideas like that. And once it was proven by mathematicians that you could do a numerical simulation, even of a chaotic system, and stay within beta of the actual system if you maintained a value of alpha around your deviations from the thing. And the Runge-Kutta algorithm is a very long-standing technique in mathematics it's like a sophisticated Taylor series. You know what a Taylor series is? Okay. Taylor series goes out in as many orders as you like. The Euler equation approximates that as a tangent. The Runge-Kutta approximates that as a fifth-order polynomial. But in addition to that, with every time you do a time step, you're going to get a slight error nonetheless. So what it does, what they call, I think it's called Gaussian renormalization at each step. Okay, so it's a particular algorithm, and therefore you don't get an amplification in the errors, which you do get out of the Euler approach. So a lot of the
variable sampling.
Yeah, so you don't variable sampling rate, and it changes in size. Yeah, worth looking at. Yeah.
Is that interest rate constant?
Oh yeah, but I can make that variable as well. I mean, I've done it in other models, and I'll show you the later model where I've done that. It's simply you start as simple as possible and add the complexities in later. That's
So there a variable risk premium that to what extent that
yeah, you can do that as well. Yeah, you can. All this stuff is just a case of how much effort do you want to put into doing a complete model. But start at the simple level, but start from stuff which is absolutely true by definition as well. So you can imagine, take it back, this is August of 1992 when I did this. This is before the neoclassicals invented the term of the Great Moderation. Okay? So I finished up, wrote my paper and submitted it to the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. It took Paul 3 years to publish, but anyway. And in that final line, I wrote this little rhetorical flourish saying that the chaotic dynamics in this paper should warn us against regarding a period of relative tranquility in a capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm. Well, that's before the neoclassicals saw the lull and called it the Great Moderation. So I was, ultimately delighted by having made that accidental discovery. So there's what you get, and this is just showing the model at just the stage of the Goodwin model itself. I'm happy to give this presentation to somebody who can pass it around, by the way, and all the models are embedded in the canvas, so you just have to click, and that loads the Goodwin model. Once you've got Minsky installed, loads it directly. And by the way, always go and check out the equation, see what's happening over there. Sometimes you'll make an error by putting the wrong variable in some places. I was doing that yesterday all the bloody time. Finally got it right. Okay, so that's done there. Off we go. And then what you see is those sustained cycles I showed you a while ago. Then I have the investment function. And of course this is the beauty of system dynamics. Neoclassicals hit students with this bullshit that if you don't like the assumptions in first year, don't worry, we generalise and take them away in following years. Well, they're struggling so hard to hang on to equilibrium. They make even more absurd assumptions in future years than they do in the early years. Okay, with system dynamics, you're not trying to hang on to equilibrium. It's all non-equilibrium modelling. So you can bring in more realism. Happily do so. So Goodwin modelled that capitalists invest all their profits. Well, they don't. They invest more than profits during a boom, less during a slump, and if they've got to finance it, so they borrow money. So it's very simple to bring that in, as I've shown you a moment ago, and that's what I've done. So they invest on the basis of the rate of profit, and those are the term values that I use there. And you saw what I've done already live here, so I won't bother repeating that. And what you get, and this is why I think it's such a useful tool for analysing that proposition from Minsky to begin with, when he said capitalism is inherently unstable. In other words, you can't reform away what I've shown you. The way you get a different result, I might as well say that right now, is you change how reactive capitalists are to the rate of profits. Let's say they're rather than having a function value of 4 there, of 10, they've got a function value of 4. We simulate that, and you get equilibrium. Now, from a policy point of view, and I really want to use this stuff for policy over time, if you're just looking at what's happening to employment and inflation, and wages share of output as a proxy for inflation in this model, if you're just looking at those, you see convergence to equilibrium. Okay? If you ignore the debt level, you don't see any problem coming at all. It's only when you include the debt level. Let's just go back to, say, a value of 6 there and see what happens. Now you're going to get, this is I think actually the cycle probably will explode there ultimately, but you can see you're getting a limit cycle type behaviour out of that. And if I just actually bump it up one more. Oh, this is another thing I haven't shown you. As well as being able to click in the sliders and drag them around, we've also set it up so you can use the arrow keys to go sideways when you get a little box there. Again, to make it possible to do simulations live. What we want to do ultimately is make this into a toolbox where we have multiple computers controlling the one simulation. Have a bunch of politicians or practical economists say, okay, you play with this and try to control the system and see what happens. Okay, so let's go to 8 as a value there. And then notice that relative rate continues growing. So it's a simple change in how reactive capitalists are to the rate of profit is in how much they're willing to invest, makes the system unstable. You can't reform capitalism by changing the nature of capitalists. It's outside the possibility of reform. So you end up with, I was showing you by those simulations, there are two main equilibria to the model. There's a good one, where you have a positive employment rate, positive wages share, and a finite debt ratio. But there's a bad one. There's actually two bad ones. Zero employment, zero wages share of output, and an infinite debt ratio. And it's only the beginning of doing the modelling, by the way. I'm emphasising that there are multiple other possible sources of cycles that I haven't included yet. And you can include them using something like the Minsky framework. So innovation cycles. I've got no changes to the technical rate of change of labour, but if I made that a function of the rate of profit, okay, then I'd have like a sigmoidal function makes sense there, so I'd get more complexity coming out of that. Capital, I haven't even put them in here, capital utilisation ratio changes. I haven't got that there, but you can add those. Innovation, inventory cycles, Metzler cycles and Kitchen cycles. Goodwin did some brilliant work on multi-cycle modelling. I've done a huge multi-sectoral model as well that gave me non-linear limit cycles out of that. Ecological feedback, which is where this technology evolved in the very first instance. All this stuff is going to make yet more causes of cycles. But what has happened at this level, and also making production functions non-linear, all that stuff will make it more complicated and give you a richer vision of the dynamics. But the beauty of starting from this level is I think you're getting the core dynamics of capitalism. And then you add them on, and that's, again, I saw Tony having a tweet this morning saying how you get any old arbitrary thing you like, out of modelling. Well, that's the same thing applies to verbal models. You got to have a conversation with an Austrian versus a post-Keynesian and see how much fun that is. Okay, they're both competing with different verbal models. They'll never resolve anything. So that's the beauty of doing it mathematically, is that at least you can reach some form of resolution, but you've got to use it in a way which is coherent. So in that sense, I don't object to Lucas arguing we needed to have a methodology for arriving mathematical models. He just chose the wrong one. Because the whole emergent phenomena element, which is what lays between micro and macro, it wasn't possible to do what he tried to do in the very first instance. But if you invert it and start from the top down, as I've done with these definitions, then you can get it right. And if you strictly expand the model using identities and definitions and actual structural things, we know you've got to have multiple inputs to produce outputs. Okay? We know you've got to have energy to make output at all, etc., etc. All this stuff can give us a realistic basis for doing it. But starting at this very, very simple level, and I wish Tony was here to hear me use this word, you don't get the deep parameters, you get the deep characteristics of capitalism. And there were characteristics that Minsky himself didn't see when he came up with his model, because this is a complex systems phenomenon. I've shown you, press the B key by accident there, pardon me. Okay, now I've shown you there's a few other ways you can do the model. That is showing it as a closed form. So the equations I showed you initially, you're working in terms of omega and lambda and d rather than absolute levels. That's programmed there as well. This is doing it using the full flow that I've shown you as just live. And it's also possible, and this is why I built Minsky, to include banking inside there. So what is actually going on, and Matthias Grasselli emphasises this when he talks about my model, whether it's stock flow consistent. He said, yes, the stock flow consistent, but because I'm defining output and I'm defining investment, the consumption is a residual. Okay? So what I've done in this particular, I'll show you, I'll bring them down, they're all embedded. If you look at this one, it's still very much a proto-banking system. Minsky's designed for much more sophisticated stuff than this. But what I've got is that wages are equal to W and workers' consumption is equal to W. Interest payments are equal to INT, and capital and bankers' consumption is equal to INT. So it gives you exactly the same basic dynamics. It's just now that it's including the debt ratio as part of the banking sector debt ratio rather than, the abstract term of D. And the ambition is to obviously build large-scale integrated models, including both financial dynamics and the physical feedback dynamics that I've shown you here. The same basic characteristics turn up. Russell might find this intriguing as to why it runs so much more slowly when it's going through the Goodwin, what we call a Godley table down here, but you can see the basic dynamics are the same. I'll let that run. You'll see later it goes through the same crashes I've shown you a moment ago. So there's those, and when you then simulate it, as I've shown you, that's the convergence process now, when you're converging to the good equilibrium. If you do that in 3 dimensions, and 3-dimensional graphs are one thing we want to add to Minsky as well, then that's the sort of process you see. Okay? And if you're just looking at the projection of that on the XY axis, which is employment versus effectively inflation, perfect, converging to equilibrium. You don't look at the debt ratio. Here's the other situation. Appears to converge and then diverges. Ditto for wages share. Notice there's a negative trend for wages share as well, which we've also seen happening empirically. This is the debt ratio. You put that together in 3 dimensions, this is what you see. Now, when I first saw that, that's when my jaw hit the floor when I was doing my PhD. I had no expectation of that particular structure applying. I thought you might get bigger cycles and then a breakdown, or smaller cycles and a crash, but rising and falling, no, I wasn't expecting that at all. Now, it turns out this was first discovered in analysing the Lorenz model, which is the first time we had a practical model of chaos. And when you do what's called a Poincaré map of this, so you show the dynamics of a 3-dimensional system passing through a 2-dimensional plane, then the way that turns up is a dynamic process bouncing between a line and a curve. And if you're down at the bottom level, you'll bounce around until you reach the first lower equilibrium down there. Above, that's a stable equilibrium. The one for the intersection up here, of course, there must be 2 intersections of a straight line with a quadratic curve, which is what that is. That's an unstable equilibrium. What this shows in Lorenz model is you pass from turbulent flow to fluid to laminar flow, smooth flow of water. But what about if your curved line doesn't quite intersect? Then what you get is apparently diminishing cycles, so you're going from turbulent flow to laminar flow, and then on the other side it goes from laminar to turbulent again. So that's the phenomenon that was first identified by Pomeau and Manaville, working with Lorenz's model, and that's exactly what I've found in the Minsky model. So in that sense, there's a comparable dynamic in capitalism to this dynamics behind the Lorenz equations as well. And you can't get that out of equilibrium thinking. It has to be a non-linear, non-equilibrium system. So really I want economics just to abandon the fetish for equilibrium that neoclassical economics has given it. And it lets me, as a result, explain 2 key phenomena which were not even visible to the neoclassicals because they ignored debt and they ignored non-equilibrium. But this gives you both the Great Moderation effect and the Great Depression all in one. Now, looking back in history, again, this is something which the model itself has directed me to, and I would never have looked at this information without the model as a guide, is that when you look back in the 1920s and 30s, you can see the same pattern we've had recently, declining cycles in inflation and unemployment followed by a crisis. So that's, the data here is a bit dicky. You can see it's in employment here, it's yearly data until 1929 when you start getting monthly data for America. And the inflation data includes the impact of the gold standard and breaking out of the gold standard and so on. So huge inflation and deflation surges there. But here's our most recent data. We don't have those same dynamics to worry about. And that's what the neoclassicals thought with the Great Moderation. And then the crisis is a total surprise. And you still see Bernanke talking about the Great Moderation as being the result of his economic policies and the Great Recession being the result of an exogenous shock. Well, both of them had the same phenomena that Minsky argued drove the cycle, which is increasing level of private debt followed by deleveraging. So the red line shows you the debt ratio to GDP. This is normalised as the American census data, so it matches the Federal Reserve data, by the way. It gives you a lower level for aggregate private debt. But the same basic dynamic occurs. That ratio is rising even though people were paying off debt. This is the rate of change of debt, which is measured over this side. It was strongly negative. for those early years. Despite the fact that people were paying debt down, the ratio was rising because deflation and falling output meant that the GDP in nominal terms fell much faster than debt did in nominal terms. Here's our more recent data. A much higher level of debt and the same basic phenomena. The crisis began when the rate of change of debt slowed down. It was severe while the American economy was deleveraging, and then recovery began when they started to lever again. So that's pretty much that period there of declining and then bottoming and finally rising. That is the recession. Okay? Would have been much deeper, except for the scale of government spending, which you can also model in Minsky, which I have done, but I'm not showing here in the talk tonight. So what I will show you is a question about making the interest rate variable. This is one thing that Matthias Griselli challenged me one day on the basis that my Minsky model gave even-handed cycles, that the booms and the slumps were as extreme as each other, whereas if you look at what happened, we had a slight sort of a boom, but mainly appeared to be stable, and then it collapsed. It was all one-sided. I said, well, that's because I haven't got prices in the system. He said, so? So half an hour, 3 hours later, I sent him back this model, which had prices inside. Then that was a lot scarier, of course, but it would actually be easier to build by simply adding supply and demand dynamics to the model I've shown you beforehand, because the model price is actually derived using supply and demand. In other words, I have a monetary flow of demand and a physical flow of goods on the other side, with the price having a lag convergence. That's the way I started. You know what I derived? Pileski's markup pricing equation. They were consistent, strangely enough. But for all the fighting we do over them, they actually end up being consistent. But this is just a rate of interest that adjusts to the rate of inflation. The rate of inflation is a markup on wage cost, which is derived from supply and demand. Inflation affecting the wages share and affecting the compounding of debt, and then the interest rate itself varying with a lag to what the rate of inflation is. So you put those together, and what you get is this model. Now, slightly more complicated, but this is done again in the same full form that I showed you beforehand. I'm just hoping we've got a font bug that came in from a third party. I just hope it won't bite this time around. Let's see. I'll slow it down a bit so you can see more slowly. Keep your eye on the employment rate, the debt ratio, and the profit share. Okay? And watch what's happening with the dynamics. And this is now, again, this is the simplest possible model. The one variation I've made to the models I've shown so far is I've put in exponential behavioural relations here. So I have a non-linear Phillips curve based on an exponential fit to the level of employment, and a non-linear investment curve based on the rate of profit. That's all. Just those two functions. Otherwise it's the same. You can also change it. Actually, let's make it linear. You've got switches and logical switches in Minsky these days, so I can turn on and off various characteristics down here. This is now a linear model. So let's run that. And so you get diminishing cycles in employment. Profit level seems to stabilise. The cycles start to get more extreme for a short while. Okay, that's the even-handed stuff, and then finally you have a total crash, which will happen. But that's still got the even-handed thing, and that's the result of the reason the booms and the same size as the slumps, or of the same magnitude. With a linear function, you're going to get a linear extrapolation of the scale. With a non-linear function, which is more realistic, let's just do the non-linear now. Reset, start again. This is where the one-handed stuff comes out of. You get a more extreme reaction to employment than when it gets high. So more of a cut-off of profit by a rising wage rate. You don't get as much as a fall in wages on the other side, because wages don't fall at a huge rate. You'll get out of a linear function. So you notice this model now has, you can see the cycles there in employment. Start off large, get smaller, then get larger again. Now they're starting to get smaller again. Deflation is applying. You can see the inflation rate's heading down towards negative. The debt ratio is still rising. Profit is cycling, but around an equilibrium level, or near an equilibrium, not around it, I might add. Okay, and then it looks like finally you've got out of those bloody cycles, system's finally settled down, we've finally reached the great moderation, and then, without warning, employment starts to collapse. Okay, inflation's become deflation, and what's going on here is the transfer of income from workers to bankers has been happening in the background all the way through. in such a way that capitalists don't really notice any trend. That once you get to the stage where deflation has kicked in, the compounding of debt accelerates. Okay. The rate of fall of wages can no longer compensate for the increasing amount going to bankers, and you finally have, after what looks like perfect stability to the capitalist, notice how long the profit line there has been constant, simply horizontal. Without warning, at some point, finally, the capitalists realise that capitalism is over, but they're the last ones to know. Okay. Now, it still is out of a relatively simple model, but I've captured a lot, I think, of the actual dynamics of capitalism by putting it together this way. And there's, just to emphasise that point, there's the falling wages share, and nobody worries about that until the crisis occurs. Okay. There's the rising bankers' share. We think that's a good thing. Capitalists have no idea until the final crisis hits. So, again, you've got to have a very complex systems model to understand where the problem's coming from, because looking at inflation, employment and profit won't give you any real indication. The one that will tell you something's going to happen is a private debt ratio, which, of course, the mainstream economics says ignore it, doesn't matter. What would they know, unfortunately? So that's the overall thing. And also, in terms of, just go to another end of the political spectrum, there is no tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Again, he's working from strict definitions. Even Andrew Kleiman couldn't argue with them, though of course he would find a way. What you instead have is a tendency for the level of private debt to grow exponentially. So there's the red line there is the profit rate, or profit share of output. You can see it's just constant until the crisis strikes. So again, it's a fallacy to say there's a trend in the profit rate, but it is true to say there's a trend in the distribution of income, that if you have rising bankers' growth level, you're going to have a crisis. And just to give a bit of an empirical argument behind this, I've been having a long discussion, as you would have seen, with Mark Lavoie and Brett Feinberger and Tom Falley, to argue that change in debt matters to aggregate demand. I think I've finally got a proper proposition of that. But I've done a little model here, and I'm waiting for Excel to start. It hasn't actually started yet. But this is a little spreadsheet to be able to illustrate why the level of debt and the rate of change of debt are crucial for causing crises in capitalism. And that just isn't going to run, so I'm going to give that a miss, given time. So what we get out of this is capitalism is, first of all, we have an approach to building models that is not ad hoc and doesn't suffer from the problems that Lucas critique have of emergent properties getting in the way. And it reveals things about capitalism we don't get out of the neoclassicals at all, okay? But it still lets us build models and add the complexity in a sensible way. And what it concludes with is that capitalism is inherently unstable, as Minsky argued, and it's prone to financial crises. And anybody who says otherwise doesn't understand capitalism, and certainly doesn't understand complex systems, which is where a lot of the errors come from. And if you want to understand complex systems, there's a brilliant resource called the Chaos Book, which is online and free. Very, very complete guide to complex systems in general. Now, I'm not totally against linear analysis. It's useful in some cases. My own group of academics at Kingston, Raphael Lindau and co, have done a beautiful model of the American economy using stock flow consistent guidelines, and just use that to project, what's the feasibility of these trends. That's worthwhile. I also use it to compare theories of money. That's fair enough. You can do steady state comparisons when they're actual non-linear, when the states are actually steady state. But the reality is a proper model has to have inherent non-linearities, as I've shown you, simply because you've got wages multiplied by the labour bill. That's an inherent non-linearity. So is compounding of debt. And what you'll get out of that is aperiodic cycles, which again is something neoclassicals don't understand. But if you look in that Chaos Book, they make a wonderful statement here about the nature of complex systems, saying the ancients tried to make, that's basically neoclassical economists, tried to make sense of all dynamics in terms of periodic motions, epicycles, and what we call integrable systems. He said, the embarrassing truth is that for a generic dynamical system, almost all motions are aperiodic. Now, that's what we're trying to identify ourselves, looking at capitalism from a non-neoclassical point of view. So we have to rethink and relearn economics from the ground up, and a huge amount we can learn from doing system dynamics properly. I still teach the neoclassical stuff well, with all the warts, because I think it's important to know how the wrong people think. I hope it's going to be a passing phase in the history of economic thought. We have to learn other schools of thought as well, but I think we could add this to the approach I've shown you as a way of building dynamic models in general, and learn complex systems and thermodynamics. And here's a bit of advertising, since I know you won't get that course at the so-called leading universities, come and join me at Kingston. Thanks very much.